Welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Christopherson. Quick podcast here on Friday. We're going to take a little time out from football talk, and we're going to devote the next 15 minutes or so exclusively to Nebraska basketball, which picked up a couple transfer portal commitments, their first ones of the cycle. And so Brian Christopherson is here today to walk us through Rienk, Mast, Brice Williams, and Nebraska's other targets. BC, where do we want to start? How do we want to start? What do you want to do here? The floor is yours.
Let's talk about the two they got.
Right.
Yeah, it was a good midweek for Fred Hoiberg's crew. He had done an interview actually on Tuesday night. He was at a Coaches vs. Cancer event for Brad Underwood in Illinois, and he was talking about the portal and how I can imagine this is what it's like everywhere. How like one day a coaching staff feels like we got three guys, we're going to get these three guys. And then the next day you're like, I don't know if we're going to get any of those guys. I think that's probably the anxiousness that surrounds the whole thing. So it's really probably very comforting right now over there to have two in the boat. And I think two pretty, proven players that sort of fit the format of what they were doing last year. Like Rienk Mast comes from Bradley and is a 6'9" guy who can also stretch the floor and shoot the three pretty well. He scored more than 1,000 points and had more than 650 rebounds during his career at Bradley. Was an all Missouri Valley Conference player for a team that won the regular season title, I think for the first time there since 95, 96. They got knocked out in the Mo Valley tournament, so they ended up having to go to the NIT.
They lost in the championship game to Drake. It's the only Bradley game I watched all year. I was watching some Drake basketball.
Yeah. How'd Rienk Mast play?
I don't remember him, so that's probably not going to add to the discussion.
Okay.
Largely what I knew is that Drake just destroyed him. I mean, it was like an 80-55 kind of game, which is sad for Bradley.
Well, it is sad for Bradley, but it's good for Nebraska that they've got Mast because he comes from that, a program that did win at a good clip, and that's sort of what the template Fred Hoiberg had with his last team. When he was getting Wrightsell and Bandamel and guys who Gary. Guys who had been on teams that had won. Derek Walker was like that when he came to Nebraska a few years ago, with obviously what happened with him at Tennessee on winning squads. So I think there's a thought that helps. And he's a real affable guy. I enjoyed talking to him. He's a physics major that's going to get his degree in a month. And I think there's all sorts of stories that we can explore with him when he gets here. But he can also stretch the floor as a big man and shoots decent, I think 35% from 3-point range. So I don't know if he's as good a ball handler necessarily as Walker. That's something we shouldn't take for granted, how good of a facilitator he was at that spot and how the offense worked through him. But I think he might be able to stretch the floor more. And then they got 6'7" Brice Williams, a guard out of Charlotte. His father, Henry Williams, was one of the great players at Charlotte, actually, and I think was all-time leading scorer there. And it wasn't talked about as much with Brice Williams, but he had a knee injury that took away his whole 21-22 season. So I think sometimes people see these lines about, well, he only started like 13 games at Charlotte last year, and it's kind of like, what's the deal there? It was a season where he was working back, I think, sort of from that injury, but he had a bunch of explosive games where he piled up more than 20 points, I think 9 times, and more than 30 points 3 times. So he's a guy who can get hot in a hurry and really fill it up, shot at a high clip from 3-point range. And he's a big guard. He's got length at 6'7" and experience, and was part of a CBI championship team in which he was the MVP of that tournament. So another guy who has some winning in his background.
The interesting thing I think right now for Fred Hoiberg is trying to figure out, okay, we got to go into the portal, we got to get these guys, but what are you putting them with that's already going to be here? I mean, they have to kind of learn what's going to happen with Keisei Tominaga. I think the assumption is that Rashawn Gary should be good to go for next year. Correct? Like that's the idea.
Yeah.
Or Jawan Gary. I think I said Rashawn Gary.
No, yeah.
Michigan defensive lineman, Green Bay Packer defensive lineman.
I knew exactly where that came from. That's the way it works when you do this job. You get you get like 20 names that you've written about in
Yeah.
your past that merge together sometimes. But yeah, Jawan, I mean, the plan is that I know for him to come back and make a go of it. And he's a junkyard dog type guy. It was a huge loss when he was gone. He's a guy who's obviously going to help your rebounding presence. So yeah, I mean, the big one is Casey and what he does there. And it's been sort of quiet on that front, which Husker fan, you're kind of thinking maybe that's good news. You're hoping, but we'll see. You do got to keep piling up shooters though, and you don't want to be a one trick pony out there. And Brice Williams is definitely a guy who can fill it up and has shown that he can get hot in a hurry.
Yeah. What's on the horizon with Nebraska recruiting? I know they have at least a visitor in town right now, and more this weekend and more next weekend, I believe.
Yeah, let's run through what we think we know. Latrell Wrightsell Jr. Is in town today, or supposed to be. He confirmed that to us earlier this week. Omaha Central grad who had played at Cal State Fullerton. Could definitely be, he could be a point guard, or he could help you in the backcourt for sure. He had a nice career at Cal State Fullerton, and he's down to Nebraska, Minnesota, and Alabama, I believe is what he said. And his father, of course, is a familiar name to some people of a certain age, my age, around Nebraska. I used to watch his dad play at the Civic Auditorium for Creighton. Very good player, and it's obviously in the genes. So he would be an interesting guy. And also, he does have a link with Hunter Sallis. I mean, there's that storyline is out there. He's been on the record talking about how Nebraska's staff, even at one point, was talking about those two together. And Hunter Sallis is supposed to visit Nebraska during the spring game weekend, the 19th through the 21st, the Gonzaga transfer. We could talk a little bit about Sallis because I think there's so many people interested in where that's going to go, because he was such a big time recruit out of Millard North. And it didn't feel like Nebraska was really that much in the fight back then, but they definitely are now, we think. And I mean, he's visiting. That tells you all you need to know. He wasn't a big, offensive weapon at Gonzaga, but I think 4.5 points per game is what he averaged. So that's a part where I think Nebraska could sell him. And you could talk more on it, Mike, but about how they've worked with players that I think maybe you could say are similar in his frame or skill set in the past, like a Bryce McGowan's, and had success elevating his offensive game. And obviously he got to the league. And so this is a place where I think Hoiberg's staff could probably do a good job convincing him, hey, in our offensive system, we can help you go up a few floors in your game on that level. And he's already got the defensive part. He reminds me a little of Bandamel in that way. He's very bouncy and long, and he just feels like he would be a real problem on the perimeter for teams. And he was. And even when I watched Gonzaga in the tournament, he was a guy who he gets his hands on the ball and creates a little havoc.
Yeah, he definitely strikes me as kind of a defense first guy, and I think that might be part of the pitch from Nebraska, is that they can help maybe unlock a little bit of his offense and point to the development of not just Bryce McGowan's, but also Delano Banton was a guy that when he first came to Nebraska, the whole conversation was they're getting an NBA player, and it was hard to see at times here in Lincoln, but they have experience of developing some of these guys, and certainly Fred Hoiberg is well respected in the NBA, and so I think some of that pitch is right there. And then of course you don't have to, with Sam Wrightsell and the success that he had, coming back home looks a little bit more manageable when you see stuff like that. And so I could see where there's a real appeal for both Lorenzo Wrightsell and for Hunter Sallis. And so I think they have the spots. I mean, we'll see kind of how that plays out. I remain very interested in what's going to happen at the point guard picture, because it's been kind of a situation where they've had guys play a little bit out of position, where they haven't had like that
Mhm.
true floor general point guard. And I'm wondering if that's something they find, or if we're in another spot where whether it's Jamarcus Lawrence, if they end up with Lorenzo Wrightsell, I mean, there's different routes where they could go, but point guard remains kind of a thing that I'm very curious what they end up doing there.
Yeah, very much so. And with Sam Grissel last year, you had a guy who, he'd have games where he would bust out for 17 or 18 points, but the one thing you could always count on him was he was such a stat filler. I mean, another thing you don't want to take for granted, and it's like, how exactly do you duplicate that? Maybe you do it a different way. Is you had that 6'7" point guard who could go get you like 8 to 10 rebounds.
When he could go post up too, it
Yeah,
was just back guys down into the lane. It was a really interesting kind
yeah,
of route last year watching them play with him as their point guard. So I am very curious about that. I I find myself just fascinated because we just don't know what that overall number is. Like, we can say there's
right.
2 spots left, but they could end up adding more. It feels fluid, I guess, is a word that would probably best describe where they're at right now, even after
Mhm.
getting these 2 guys in Rienk Mast and Brice Williams.
Yeah, I think sort of like when we began and we were talking about how a coach must feel, where it's like, I might have these guys on Tuesday and then on Wednesday, you're like, I
Yeah.
don't know. That's sort of how you are probably with current roster. Maybe there's some things known that isn't public yet. That's always possible. I'm not saying there is. But yeah, there's 2 spots open right now. But of course that could change and you could have more. Now, one thing we should bring up, I'll go through a couple of the other names that are supposed to visit or have been on the calendar. One of them is Brady Dunlap, who's beginning a visit this weekend. He's from California, and he's a top 150 player out of high school. And we do kind of, this happens with football too, as you know, we get so caught up sometimes in the portal segment now. You don't want to lose touch with guys like this who, you could really develop, who are really good high school players, who at one point was kind of linked with Notre Dame, but now it's wide open. There's good schools that are after him. It's Nebraska, it's North Carolina, Penn State, St. John's, Villanova. That's his top 5. So I mean, you, that's a player you'd like. And the advantage Nebraska has here is Hoiberg was on him from the jump.
Mhm.
And so there is a relationship that is meaningful there. And I don't know. I do feel like some guys believe Nebraska's got some momentum, and they kind of got out of the quicksand last year with that 16-16 season. So I think you can kind of preach that progress a little more this offseason.
You know what's interesting is sort of thinking about, like, we've seen a couple iterations of them going into the portal and having to pull 5, 6 guys. It felt like they were very intentional in who and what they took last year from a
Mhm.
personality standpoint. Do you think that, just based on your conversation with Brink Mass, do you think that's still kind of the thing? Like, they're trying to line up the personalities maybe a little bit better than the first few years under Fred Hoiberg?
Yeah, I do think that's a big deal. And not that
Because
they
this
had.
this past team clearly liked each other a
Oh,
lot,
yeah, they
and I
did.
think that made things a lot easier to handle, the lower points when they had that run in February.
Mhm. I believe Fred Hoiberg when he said, um, multiple times that it was one of his favorite teams to coach. I just think they were, because they were so linked together. Now, it might be tough to duplicate that every season, exactly what that group had. Like, it seemed like Grissel and Walker just hit it off from the beginning, and they had that type of relationship where both were mature enough guys to not take anything personal too, like when you're
Mhm.
out there on the floor and something goes wrong, and you know when to just be quiet and when to get in somebody's ear a little bit. So you have to figure that out with guys. But Rink Mast, to your question, comes off as one of those guys who's just sort of like older than he is. I mean, he's like 21, 22 now, but he played with Jason DeRusso and Lance Jeter
So wild.
um, for the pro team in the Netherlands, and played for a couple seasons with them. And I asked him about that, and he said that was a big benefit to him. Sort of seeing like how these older guys, like, how do you do it? How do you
Mhm.
survive for 15 years as a basketball player at that level? And that would make you grow up quick if you're 17 years old and you're around, men who are 35, doing that stuff. Not if they're around like me when I was 35, but other 35-year-olds who are mature. So I do think he's going to fit well. And, Brice Williams, a basketball family, has been in the college game 4 years. So that you'd think that there's something there too that's pretty stable.
Yep, absolutely. Anything else you want to toss in? Any other names? Anything that we need to mention here as we
Well,
finish up the Nebraska basketball extravaganza?
JV McCollum from Siena is on the calendar for.
That's a potential point guard, I believe, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
from 15th to the 17th. So he's one I'd keep in mind. I think another big one is John Hughley.
Which I
The
don't know, is that still going to happen with Brink Mast? I mean,
I don't know.
yeah.
I mean, you got, but the I don't know what their big situation is going to look like exactly. I hope it's all right with Blaze Takeda, just the injuries that were sort of chronic
Mhm.
last year with the ankle. So you do have to think about it from that angle, like if you need to stack another big there or whatever. But yeah, that's the thing with where it is now. It's sort of an evolving deal. You get a commit like Rink Mast, or you get if one of the other guards raises his hand over the next 2 to 3 days, maybe that changes the equation, and one of these names we've been talking about or that's been out there for a couple of weeks isn't. So that could shift by the day. But those are the names who have been out there that could be possibilities. I think right now the Husker fans are just feeling a little bit more at ease that you got two in the bank now, and now it's like, okay, all right, I start to see the roster forming here, and I would think it's that way for the coaches too.
Yeah, it has to be. I mean, just getting, what do they say? Getting the first one's always the toughest. And so then you kind of build out from there. All right, Brian, appreciate your time here on a Friday morning, getting a little basketball talk in. Of course, plenty of football. There's media availability on Saturday. I believe you guys get Matt Rule. Is that correct?
At Rule on Saturday, I believe it's going to be a pretty big scrimmage day too.
Ooh.
So it'll be interesting if much gets said. But yeah, so 1 week until the spring game, and that's of course going to have it's going to have recruits of matter from a variety of
All
sports,
sports.
obviously.
No doubt about it. There'll be plenty of coverage of everything at Husker247.com this weekend. Of course, we'll have the practice. We'll have whatever basketball news comes out of these official visits. There'll be some recruiting stuff as well. So be sure to check out Husker247.com. We'll be back next week. We're going to have a hype cast for the spring game, and we'll have another podcast before we get there on Friday. For Brian Christopherson, I'm Mike Schaefer. We're Husker247. We'll catch you next week.